Hello everyone, today I'll be talking about Micrometer. This decision came after someone on the comments asked me if I could talk about this subject. And since I already start to talk about OpenTelemetry and observability, it seems a good idea to why not to talk about Micrometer at this time. So I'll be introducing this framework, which by the way, it's to collect metrics, what are the main components, purpose and problem solve, using Micrometer in regular applications, mainly Java applications, but I think it also works in JavaScript, but you can search for it if you want. Micrometer with Spring Boot and Actuator, it integrates quite smoothly with Spring Boot and Actuator. How to export these metrics to Prometheus. Prometheus, it's a let's say an enterprise open source application that you can use to collect all the metrics and centralize and create alerts from the metrics. That's main idea of Prometheus, and I will install one and show you how you can use it with Micrometer. That's why I will, of course, will be running Prometheus, query metrics in Prometheus, and common patterns and challenge regarding this framework. So let's go. What is Micrometer? It's your observability Swiss Army knife. A vendor-neutral metrics facade for application observability, as I said previously, and simplifies monitoring across various systems. Monitoring metrics, not logs, for instance, trace. These are handled by different applications. So let's do a quick introduction to it. So what it is, it's an open source metrics library targeting the Java virtual machine. Again, it's a simple facade and supports multiple monitoring backends, Prometheus, Grafana, Datadog, but you can also export to login database and things like that. Usually you want to export to Prometheus or to an Actuator, for instance, in a Spring Boot, but in an enterprise environment, probably you will have something like Prometheus or Grafana, or maybe you are in a company that are paying and you should have something like Datadog or there are others, Dynatrace and things like that, they are highly related with observability, and one of their features is to collect metrics. So why should you use it? It's standardized metrics collection, and of course you are not logged into a vendor, and enhanced observability in distributed systems. So what is the role of Micrometer in observability? It's this one, the metrics. It gets quantitative data like CPU usage, request latency, and others that you want. You can define, you can create counters, for instance, say I want to count these things. I want to understand how much time it takes, for instance, to process an order, and I want some statistics about it. And you can do that with Micrometer, and of course with the help of Prometheus, because Prometheus can handle this kind of metrics and this distribution statistics and things like that. But the main idea is Micrometer focus on metrics. It complements logging and tracing tools, meaning that it's the idea of Micrometer just for the numbers. The logs and trace, you should have other tools. For instance, if you use OpenTelemetry, you can use OpenTelemetry. It's quite good for trace, even metrics. Logs not so well, but it handles logs because logs is it's somehow tricky because usually you need a framework like Log4j or Logback to handle logging, and this framework should integrate somehow with OpenTelemetry. But that's a completely different discussion. But today we'll target metrics. If you want to know more about this, I'm creating videos about OpenTelemetry, and I will discuss all these issues around these three pillars, including metrics, not using Micrometer, but using OpenTelemetry. But maybe you are starting, so should I use OpenTelemetry for observability or Micrometer? If you only need metrics, maybe Micrometer it's a better idea. It's simple, it's targeting. Your application will not have let's say noise in the imports, noise in the code, because you are only targeting metrics, not the meters. It's something that you use to collect metrics. And if you don't need to handle logs, let's say correlated with metrics and trace, Micrometer it's a good solution. But now I want to correlate everything, the metrics, the logs, and the trace. Maybe you should target something like, for instance, OpenTelemetry can be a good idea. So what are the main components of Micrometer if you are targeting Micrometer? Or maybe you can start with Micrometer if it's the first time that you talk about observability. At least you have an idea from the point of view of metrics. So the main components of Micrometer, we have the meter, which is the core abstraction for counter, gauge, timer. These will be the components that take data. Like, okay, I want to create the number of times this API, it's called. So you would need a counter, and okay, it's a meter. Now I need to measure the average of my calls, what is the minimum, what is the maximum, things like that. So you need a timer, and so on and so on. Then you need a meter registry. A meter registry, it's the guy that will receive this data and will export for Prometheus to logging to a database. You always need two. In complement, you can use other three things. One, it's text. You can say, I want this counter, but this counter, it's for this service. And this another counter, it's for another service. This counter, it's when the status of the HTTP response is 200. This is for 04, not found. You can put text, meaning you have, it's the same counter, but you can add text to it. It's like adding dimensions to your information. Then later you can query and say, give me the number of HTTP calls where, for instance, were not found, or where 200, okay. That's the main idea of the text. Binders, it's a kind of, let's say, pre-built set of metrics that can be collected without you have to develop and spread through all the code these informations. For instance, to collect information about Java virtual machine, the question is, where do you put this in your code? Because your code is targeting business. So some binders are provided. So you say on an application start, you say something like, okay, I want to collect this information also. And you create a binder. You don't need this counter gauge times. They are already pre-packed here, and it collects these informations and they will be sent for Prometheus or other systems that are receiving your metrics. And you have also the observation API, which is advanced features when you need more advanced concepts. I will not talk too much about them in this video. I created a set, let's say 10 videos about Micrometer, and today I will not go deep on advanced concepts, otherwise I will need hours to explain everything. But what I promised today, I will show you how to collect some of the metrics using meter, the meter registry, maybe text, but I will explain what are binders and observation API. And you will see an application collecting metrics, as I said before, and export Prometheus, and I think it's a great start for you if it's the first time that you are seeing Micrometer. So how to use Micrometer in a regular application. First, you add Micrometer dependency to the Maven, and we will see in a moment what it is. You initialize a meta registry because you need to export to a specific place, okay? And then you create and register meters like counter, gauge, and things like that. And then you export metrics to a monitoring system. For example, you want to track API requests, okay? And you want to probably use a counter, let's say like this, in the meter registry. If you are using a console application, not a web application, you have to export this to a specific place. If it's logging, it's okay. But if for instance, if it is you are targeting, for instance, Prometheus, the most common way, there are workarounds that you can do, but the most common way, you need to create a kind of HTTP server, at least create using, you have an API in Java, you don't need to install Tomcats or things like that, where you can create, let's say, an HTTP endpoint where Prometheus can get this information. If it is for Prometheus, if you have a system that it's not pulling, but you can push, you don't need this HTTP server. So if you wonder, okay, I want to create a Prometheus application, but I want a Java application, I don't want a Spring Boot. This Java application needs to provide an HTTP endpoint where Prometheus can collect. I think that Prometheus can also receive direct API calls to send information, but this is a kind of workaround and it's not a good practice. Usually the idea of Prometheus is to go to get information, not receive the information. Okay, let's see a code sample for a regular application finally, and imagine that you want to use a Prometheus. So you can see you have a main, and then this is the meter registry. You can see that you are creating a Prometheus meter registry. If you remember, the meter registry, it's the entity that will receive your data and send to someplace. And in this case, it will be Prometheus. So you have the metrics, the API, add registry here, and then now you create a counter, a meter, and you say it's about API requests. I even create a tag, which is for this endpoint. Okay, this is the meter, but you can put different, let's say you can tag specific counts. You can say something like, okay, increment a request, but under this hello. Then you can create another request with the same name, but for a different endpoint, for instance. And when you increment, it will increment, let's say, the same API requests, but in a different dimension. It's like you have a tuple. It's like if your number one, it's number 1, hello. Number 1, let's say, create user, something like that, or a post or whatever is the address that you have on your HTTP. Okay, and then you can do something like a registry scrape, and it will provide you the output of the metrics. That's a regular application. I listed here some other options that you have to export, like logging. If you want to export logs, I don't know if it's useful. Maybe if you integrate with something called MDC, that it's quite used in observability. MDC, it's a very simple feature that, for instance, Logback has, where you can add attributes to your log message, and it's quite useful for later query the logs. If you want to if you don't know it and you want to find it on the internet, it's MDC. All of the letters capitalized. You have also custom file registry. You can write metrics, for instance, to files, and Open Telemetry. You can also integrate with Open Telemetry. Open Telemetry already contains metrics, but if you have an application that already uses Micrometer, you can integrate with Open Telemetry if you want. Okay, and there are other like Influx database, Java, JMX, and things like that. So Micrometer in Spring Boot, that's one that I'm targeting here. First, you have an actuator for that, expose that endpoints for monitoring, as you know, the Spring Boot actuator. Not only metrics, but beans and things like that. I already created a video about actuators in my Spring Boot series. And you can also integrate the micrometer. It auto-configures the metrics. So what should you do? First, you add these dependencies to your POM or Gradle, Spring Boot Starter Actuator if you want actuators, and Micrometer Registry Prometheus if you want the Registry Prometheus, this guy here, to be the one. So the guy that will collect the metrics. And then you can configure the application of your application, because you have to expose the actuators. This is not about Micrometer, it's about the actuators. The actuators, usually they are hidden, and you have to expose them because they will be public, somehow public. That expose information about your applications. And if you want to access metrics from the Prometheus, meaning from this Prometheus meter registry, okay, you use Actuator Prometheus, unless you change this address, as you know, if you understand actuators. But if you write metrics is also an actuator that exists by default in Spring Boot that doesn't need Micrometer. Metrics collects information about your Spring Boot application. But if you want more than that, you can add, for instance, Prometheus, and that information will be provided there also. So let's see some, just a sample if you want to develop an application yourself. So you have the Spring Boot setup. You need to add the actuator and the registry Prometheus. You don't need more than these two. Everything that it's necessary, it's encapsulated here on the Micrometer registry Prometheus, even the actuator regarding Prometheus. And these are the common actuators of Spring Boot. And one way for you to expose the actuators, it's like this on your application. If you are using properties, it's the same. You just use point after the management and after the points. So management, endpoints, web exposer, and you include health, Prometheus, and metrics. This only exists here because of this dependency. Okay, otherwise it doesn't exist by default on Spring Boot. But this one, metrics, exists by default on Spring Boot. So Spring Boot actuator endpoints, actuator health status, Prometheus metrics in Prometheus format, metrics here, the tailored metrics view, and custom metrics using meter registry for application specific metrics, and this will be the one that we'll be using. In our case, it will be Prometheus. How to export metrics to Prometheus? It's a time series database, by the way. The Prometheus, it has a web interface, a simple one. It's not the best one to use in production. Usually the companies or anyone use Grafana to have better dashboards, but in our case, we'll use the interface for Prometheus, and usually it's enough for testing to check. You can see a chart, you can see in table mode the values being collected. And the configuration, we should enable, as you saw, the actuator Prometheus. And then we have to configure Prometheus to scrape the endpoint. Again, because the idea of Prometheus, it's not, you don't send information to Prometheus. Prometheus will collect information from your application. So you should expose an endpoint on your application where the Prometheus can get this data, and it will be this one, Actuator Prometheus. Okay. So how to configure Prometheus? First, you have to install, of course, download Prometheus and install it on your machine, then it is just run the application. I will show you in a moment. Wow, but the configuration there will be something like this. You have on the Prometheus YAML, you have script configs. You give it a name. You put your where your actuator Prometheus it's configured by default. This is one, but you can change the name. You can specify the interval of the to get this, to collect this data from here, and then you have the static configs, meaning where exists this Spring Up, this job, and usually you can put something. This is your Spring Boot application. By default, usually this is port, but if you change the port, don't forget to change it here. But we will see in practice how to configure this. So how to run Prometheus? First, download it. Then update Prometheus with this information. Of course, you already have your Spring Boot application, because you should know about this at least, and where is your application running. Okay, then you run Prometheus and you can access this local host. Okay, this is where Prometheus have a web interface for you to see information, and I will show you in practice a little bit more about Prometheus. And then to execute, usually if you execute only this command, it should be enough. By default, there is this file. It's on the folder of Prometheus, and you will read it by default. You don't have to clearly specify. But if you want to create a different YAML file because you don't want to change the original one just for your testing, you can specify the config file here, and maybe give it a different name, like Prometheus dev, or dev1, or test, or proof of concept, or whatever name do you want for your configuration. So now querying metrics in Prometheus, there is something called PromQL. I will not go deep on this, just facts here. I will create videos in the future when I will be talking about open telemetry and observability. I will go more deep on Prometheus. Today, I'll just say that the language is called PromQL. It's Prometheus query language. And usually if you write something like this, and it's a query, because if you have this metric, API request total, it's a query. It will show you the value of this. But you can also create things like what is the rate per second, and even you can, for instance, put here like 5 minutes, the API requests, this is the rate, for instance, and you can create things like Instagram, and even the quantile here, you put here the metric, the bucket, and you will give a kind of histogram about your information. There are a lot of things that you can do with Prometheus, and this is one of the reasons for this server to be so popular, because you can do a lot. The query, it's quite powerful from the math, or let's say metrics analysis point of view. Let's see some examples. For instance, this is the tag, okay, API requests for this endpoint. So this is the metric that we can create, and then these are the tags. You just use this symbol, but this is also about the Prom query language from Prometheus. Again, the rate, the Instagram, this is just examples, a kind of a summary of what I explained it here, but I wanted to show you this here, and you have a point where you can see some of the queries that you can apply on your examples. But read the documentation about Prometheus. You can learn a lot to explore the information that you can get from the metrics. So the common patterns here when we are developing the micrometer, this is we would say that the pattern is more about what we can do with information that you can collect. So you can use the counter to track monotonically increasing values. So you can, let's say, count things in good English. Okay, for instance, the number of login attempts, number of checkouts, number of request APIs, and things like that. You can use a gauge like to monitor fluctuating values, like things active sessions, queue size. It's a gauge is something like you say, okay, what is the current number for this? You are not counting this. You just want to need what is the number here. Okay, so what is the number of active sessions? What is the queue size? And maybe you can create later alerts if you are reaching a point that you say, okay, after this number from our tests, sometimes the system starts to degrade, so I want to receive an alert. And you can create alerts around this. I will not show you in this video, but it's one of the features of Prometheus. Okay, of course, you have also timer, API response timer. It's quite good to understand if the system is degrading, you can see if the difference between min and max of the time, or the duration, it's becoming larger and larger and larger. and then you start to wonder, maybe the system is degrading. You can also add tags, as I said previously, like endpoint, status, okay, and we have the observation API, which you can annotate methods, and I'll show you an example in a moment after Spring Boot 3. So let's see one example of a service in custom metrics using Spring Boot. So you import Micrometer core, meter registry, and you have here an order service, okay, and we are injecting here a meter registry, for instance. It's a way to do it. Remember that in Spring Boot, and if you don't know Spring Boot, check my videos about Spring Boot. It uses the inversion of control or dependency injection pattern. So most of the time you can just inject things and Spring Boot will instantiate them for you. It will try to find the bin that implements this interface, for instance, Prometheus, if it's there, and it will inject it here. And now what you can do with this is you just create a counter, for instance, for number of orders created. You are adding a dimension or a tag like type online, and you are adding this counter to this registry. If it's Prometheus, this metric will be exposed to Prometheus. But you can also expose to other meta registries like logging files, as I explained it to you earlier. And of course, when you create the order, of course, the code will be more complex than this one. But at the end of the day, you want to do something order counter, increment this one. Okay, that's one example. Another way to do it, that's something that I talked before, it's using an annotation, and you can do something like this. Observed, for instance, for a login, you put here the user metric. This is just a name for you. This is the technical name for the metric behind it, and you put over this method, and behind the scenes it creates a lot of information. By default, observed creates a timer metric to how much time it took to run this method, for instance, use login to measure the duration of the login method execution. And if there are relations with trace, spans, and contexts, they will also be handled here. It's possible with Micrometer to integrate these metrics with the trace and spans. And if you read more about this, and I will explain in a future video in more detail, this annotation, it will also be handled by this annotation, the trace, spans, and context, and things like that. But for our case here, let's say that at least it takes the time that for the execution of this method, which can be quite nice if this is a method that is doing the login, and say this is the time it takes to do a complete login. Of course, if you need more methods than this one, and you have an APIs, okay, maybe it's not the best approach to use the annotation, but it's a different way. For instance, at the service level, where you don't need to put this kind of code, let's say like this, inside the methods, because it somehow creates some pollution on the methods. It's when you need to mix business with no business data. So common challenges: high cardinality, too many tags can overload Prometheus. Be careful with that. Configuration errors or endpoint exposure. That's probably on myself side. It's always it's always an issue. Every time I install Prometheus and I try to scrap, there is something. Always I need some troubleshooting and think about networking and check what happens. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. So, but it can be quite easy to fail this configuration, and it will be easy to forget something about it. Performance overhead. Excessive metrics can impact performance. If you have a lot of metrics and you asked for them to be processed every 2 seconds or 3 seconds, it can be a problem. So be careful about when you combine all these variants on collecting metrics, but I will address this in a future video. Data retention, managing large volumes of time series data. If you collect everything to Prometheus has a good database, but okay, check the space. It can grow really, really fast. Imagine that you have a system with thousands of requests and you are collecting all the information, all kinds of counters, and sending to a Prometheus every 3 seconds. So you can do the math. It will be really, really fast to create megas or gigabytes of information. And of course, there's some learning curve, mastering the PromQL, the query language on Prometheus, and Micrometer APIs, but that's our job, right? Another challenge is high cardinality, metrics with many unique tags. Be careful with that. Usually the tag should be something like region stats. Don't specify like user ID. Unless your project it's a very sensitive project with only 4 or 5 users and you want to collect metrics because it's a kind of a secret thing or confidential document management thing, and it's important for you to target each user. Maybe you want to measure the performance of the people. Maybe you are hiring external and it's important for you to measure something related with the people. Then you user IDs. Otherwise, try to group in region and stats, because I don't see big advantages to say, okay, when these API requests are being done to our system, and for this user ID it was 3 times, why is this useful? For the business point of view, probably will not. It will be more monitoring people, and you should have a good reason to do that. Okay. Aggregate metrics before exporting and configure managed metric distribution for histograms. It is a quite advanced concept, but it supports histograms and things like that on the metrics distribution in statistics. I will not address in this video, but you also have this feature. Some challenge, again, excessive metrics collection slows down the application, as I was explaining earlier. And ways to work around this if you really need all this information. Sample metrics selectively. Sometimes there are words tricky to say. Use management metrics export to limit exports. You can export, put some limitations, read a little bit about it. I will address this in future videos. Today I was just want to target Micrometer, but I want to show you the features that you have available, and the leverage binders for efficient Java virtual machine monitoring, something that I said previously, rather than putting everything on your code. And I can always ask the question, where in your code you want to collect metrics about the Java virtual machine? Maybe you can put in a specific method because you are using a very complex algorithm that takes a lot of CPU, but you can go differently and you can just say something new Java metrics and bind to registry. So you create a registry, you put this on start of your application, and from now on all the Java virtual machine metrics will be sent to this registry that you created. This is called binders because they have a kind of a pack inside with all information that you need. So in terms of architecture, a simple view. So you have your Spring Boot app, do an HTTP request. It will record metrics to the micrometer. The micrometer will export this to Prometheus, to this Actuator. And if you are using, for instance, Grafana can query metrics on Prometheus. In this video, I will not show you how to use Grafana. I'll talk it. It's quite easy. You just install and there is a connector to Prometheus if you want to see it. But in a future video, I promise you that I will. And then you can have a nice dashboard to see the metrics using Grafana. But we also have a web view that you can use at least for development purpose about the metrics. But Grafana, it's nicer. You can create types of charts and things like that. Prometheus is just a raw one with a simple chart and tables that you can see, but usually are enough for a start. Okay, in a distributed system observability, you have the REST controller. This is your application lives, and the micrometer will live in your application. Then it exposes here a Spring Boot Actuator, okay, and the Prometheus. If you want just this is more a sequence what happens here. It's about how you build from the architect point of view. You have your Spring Boot app and you have a monitoring, which is always external to it. Okay, again, the configuration and how to run the Prometheus. If you need a place to return here, you can say something global, scrape interval, meaning every 15 seconds, the Prometheus will go to this address here, /Actuator Prometheus, okay, and this is how to start the Prometheus to execution. Okay, let's see a more complex example, similar to the one that I will be creating. So you have, for instance, a need counter, you have this meter registry, and API hits here, and endpoint metrics register, and for another one you can have here, this is the constructor, of course, and every time this address it's requested, you increment and the metric is recorded. It's just, if you try this, it should work out of the box in your first example. Okay, best practice, use text wisely, keep cardinality low, leverage binders, again, to avoid pollution on your code, collecting everything. There are a set of binders that you can use for cache, Java virtual machine, and things like that, that you can use. You just put on the start of your application and you add to the registry. And again, the meter registry, meaning for instance, Prometheus meter registry. You enable examples, link metrics to trace. If you are using trace in your application, it's possible. Monitor key metrics like latency, error rates, throughput. This is really important in any architecture nowadays. And of course, you can test locally using Prometheus and Grafana as a dashboard. Of course, you need also your application, at least a Spring Boot application or a Java application. So in conclusion, Micrometer is a powerful vendor-neutral metrics asset. It simplifies observability, integrates seamless with Prometheus, it exports directly to Prometheus, addresses challenges like high cardinality and performance, and enables proactive monitoring and troubleshooting. So if you want some reference, this is the site for Micrometer. Of course, Spring Boot you can also find in docs, Prometheus for you to download and have documentation, of course. And if you want to try Grafana, you can also go to this address. So thank you. Now we'll be providing you a practical example using Prometheus Spring Boot application, and we'll see in a moment. So this is my application here. So this is just a REST controller, simple one, and you can see, let's start with the POM. So the first thing that you should do is to make sure that your Spring Boot application has this Actuator. You can, if you want to develop a Spring Boot application, check my first videos about Spring Boot. I have a tutorial of how to create from zero. You will go to an address called Start Spring IO, and you can create a default one out of the box, and you can just start from there, and you can put this code there, and it should work. Okay. So here you add the Actuator, which will be the endpoint that will expose different types of information from Spring Boot. This is not related directly with Micrometer. This is Spring Boot only. It means to expose information about internals of the application. This one is to allow to create a REST controller. It's a web, and this one it's Registry Prometheus. And you can always ask, where is Micrometer? The Micrometer, it's this one. So it's Micrometer Registry Prometheus. There are other ones, but since we are targeting Prometheus, when we use Micrometer Registry Prometheus, everything is included by default here. So at the end of the day, this is one of the most important for my Micrometer. This one allows to expose the actuators from Spring Boot. Otherwise, this will not work. And Starter Web is to have a web applications. Okay. Here we have to expose the actuator like this. Management, endpoints, web, exposure, health, Prometheus, and metrics. And you will see these three in a moment. And here is just the name of the application. It's not mandatory, but you can put it. And I'm changing this port to 10,000 of the application just to avoid any conflict with the 8080. Okay. And now I have this work REST controller, and the work REST controller, it will be our API that we'll be testing. So we have a counter, which we'll call it work request counter. We have a timer, which is a duration, and the random is just to create, to simulate, to not return always the same number. So if something takes one second or 1 second, .1 and things like that. So in the constructor here, I'm injecting here the meter registry. It will be Prometheus because our POM is using Prometheus. It will be the bin available. And now I'm creating this counter called work requests total with a description, and I'm adding it to this one, which behind the scenes, it's the Prometheus one. And here I'm creating also for the timer, which is work duration in seconds, duration of the work. And then it will be some, let's say, statistical thing. Okay, these are the published percentages. I want to publish the 0.5, 0.95, and 0.99. You can choose others if you want. What is the minimum expected value, the maximum expected value, and duration. This is configurations if you want to handle statistics around the duration. And I created this API. This is just work because it's related with work request data. So we increment every time. And then there is a duration to put some in here. So I'll do a thread sleep, 100 milliseconds plus, let's say, some random between 0 and 900 here. And so we'll have different times to register here. And you can see that I'm registering using this record. And I create another one just to show you this annotation working, which is called observe task. This will be the metric that we should see. And again, since by default, if you remember, the observer thinks that the metric is a timer, so I put here a thread sleep again with a random between 200 and 600, because when you sum 200 with 400, we have 600. So let's see this working. And I created here just a simple Python application. Okay, I just provide the code if you want here. And the only thing that it does is randomly just calls the endpoint API work and API observer task, which are these ones. You can see API observer task and the API work. And it will be in random order. Because otherwise, if we call one and the other, the counter here will always be the same for both, for this one and this one. So it will not be a nice thing to see. And I want to have two charts and show you the different values. That's why I put here true, false, true, true, and true, false, meaning that this will be true, let's say 75% of the time, and this one 50%. And that's it. The only thing that we have here is just to call the endpoint. It's quite easy in Python to call endpoints. I put here the address, and we just request get, and that's it. It is as simple as this in Python. I like Python because of this. It's really simple to create in tests or connect to APIs and handle JSON. It's really, really, really simple. So let's put the application first to run our Spring Boot. Let's wait a moment. Okay, now we have here this script will execute 300 API calls. So I will execute this guy. I should have here already a session for it. Python simulations, which is this one. And let's start. Okay. It's calling the APIs, and let's see what can we show here. So this is our application 10,000, and we have Actuator, and let's start with the first one, which is health. And the application itself, it's the default in Spring Boot. It's quite common to use this in enterprise. Then we have the metrics, are not related with Micrometer. It's by default provided by Spring Boot, and you can see things like application ready time, executor pool, Java virtual machine information, process, Tomcat, and our two metrics here. Even if they are being taken by the Micrometer will expose them also as metrics in our Spring Boot. And if, of course, but you can say, okay, these are the names, but I don't have values. If you want the values, you just put after the name of the metric that we are seeing here. If I put something work requests total and I click it, you can see the details here, the name, the description that we provide in our code, and a statistic being used, it's the count. The value, it's now 19, and there are no tags in our call. Okay. Let's put some pretty print. If you, for example, the duration in seconds, so we can see the difference. Okay, let's see. Again, this is the duration, but even the duration, it's still a count, but it's grouped by different statistics. Is the count, total time, and the max time. So we have more information because it's regarding time. Now let's start our Prometheus. And for Prometheus, first let me show you. So the first thing in the Prometheus, if you download it, you will see that you have this file prometheus.yml. I downloaded it here, and I will show you. You can see you have these executables because I'm in Windows, and you have the configuration here. Okay, and this is the file. And there are a lot of comments here, some alerts that I'm not using, but the things that are useful for us, it's this one. By default, Prometheus monitors itself. That's why you have this address here. So this is the metrics. It's an endpoint provided by Prometheus. So when we start Prometheus, Prometheus also runs and has metrics to expose, so it collects himself. It's quite strange, but it makes sense. And we can have our in configuration like this. So we create our Spring Boot, we put Prometheus here, and we have the target, which localhost, and you can even add some labels like app Prometheus, so you can see inside Prometheus, not Prometheus here, it's not, I don't like this one. Why not Spring Boot? Makes sense. I don't know why I wrote, it was a copy paste probably. So this is for our application, which is in this port. By the way, if you return to our application, we have the Actuator, of course, Prometheus in our Spring Boot application. You can see that's a lot of information here. But you can see, for instance, here our work requests total metrics. But there are other metrics being collected and exposed to Prometheus with the values. And you can see even here values from the application start time in seconds. If you explore this information, you can see that some of it you can understand. Other it's related to Java Virtual Machine. Maybe it's not easily to be understood, but the ones, the metrics that we created, you can see, for instance, it's here. And if you refresh, you can see this number, it changes. Now we have 63. If we refresh, 64, because it's our script, if you remember, that is executing 300 times, it's reaching 100. So let's start now our Prometheus. Just again, just download, unzip, and just execute. It is as simple as this. So I don't need to provide the name. You can, but by default, you will look for this file. So let's start. And usually if everything starts well, you don't see any error message here, and you can see that it read the configuration here. So now if it's starting, we can do something like on this port, and you can put here a query. But the first thing that I usually ask for people to do is go to this status, target health. Target health, let's say, confirms to you if your configuration is working, because you can see here it's the metrics from Prometheus itself, but our application are here, and you can see that you have this Actuator Prometheus, which is, by the way, the same address that we have here. So this address, it's provided by your Spring Boot application, and Prometheus is targeting this text here. It interprets this text, and it's going here every a few seconds. And how many seconds is coming here? It depends on the number that you put it here. And it should be something, I put here 3 seconds. It's not a good, maybe 15 seconds, it's better. 3 seconds, it's really aggressive, but just for us to see the charts growing. But it's the scrape interval, meaning that the Prometheus here is going to this address every 3 seconds. Okay, and you have here the labels, the instance, the job, and it's up. It means that it's reading the data correctly. So let's see some data here, and let's take our, for instance, requests total like this. Usually when you start to work here, it should show you the metrics that you can see. Okay, if I put total here and execute, okay, it already has this one. It's just a simple one. And if you put a chart, you can see the chart appearing here. It's the requests total. Maybe it's not a good metric to put here. Let's put a different one, because it will always grow. It's just counting the number of that it's of what's happening. Let's put a different one, like work duration seconds max. This one should be variable, I think. Okay, refresh. It's already, okay, it's still executing. This is working. Output here, let's do some refresh. Let's see our graph. Okay, sometimes it's change a little bit this one. Okay, this is a better one. Work duration in seconds. It's better because you can see these 3 percentiles here, and you can see some variance of what's happening. And if you put the mouse over, you will say, okay, this is for the quantile 95. This is for the middle one, the values, and you can see that the values are varying between 0, 55 and the 65. And this the information that you can get. There are other ones that you can explore, other metrics if you want here. Let's say what we have here. We can always return to here and check. Let's say work duration. JVM, something like JVM, maybe it's a good one. JVM virtual machine. Class, no, it's not a good thing. Memory allocated, memory promoted bytes. Let's see what happens if we use this Java virtual machine. Okay, it should be quite simple, but you can see some variance in the memory. And of course, you can always combine all of these. So this is how Prometheus works. I will go more deep on Prometheus in a future lesson. I don't want to spend more time here. The video is already long because I want to provide you how to use Micrometer, what it is, how to implement a system with Prometheus and Micrometer. So now we have this application here, our Spring Boot with only this okay, this is this one, it's the Spring Boot with a REST control. You can have multiple REST controls, services. You can create metrics for access to database, number of queries, and things like that. Probably out of the box, sometimes Spring Boot already is ready to send you some of these metrics. Maybe you don't need to count them, so read the documentation about it. So we have this application. We have on the side the Prometheus running and scraping the values from your Actuator here on the Prometheus. I think it's a good solution in 25 minutes, 45 minutes. I wish it was 25. It's not easy to explain all this in 25 minutes, but in 45 minutes. I hope this is useful for you. I hope you now understand how to use Micrometer in your Java application, Spring Boot application, and at the same time using Prometheus. I think it's a great start. You have something to work on. But my promise is in the future I will create more videos about Micrometer, Prometheus, and even add more fun to these charts. It is just simple ones because our metrics, it's quite simple, but I'll promise that I'll integrate Grafana at least here, and we'll have nice charts and better metrics here, correlating metrics and things like that, so you understand better how to use Prometheus. And of course, I will not forget to use also alerts that you can create here. You have these hints, so we can create rules and say to do something, to alert something when a specific metric reach a specific point. So I hope you liked this video. I hope it was useful for you. Be free to comment, please subscribe, propose things. I create this video because someone commented and wanted to understand how Micrometer works, and I have time to do it, and it makes sense on my videos from the architecture point of view, and that's the result. So don't be shy, just comment. And by the way, help me to increase and share my channel. If you have friends, maybe you can check with them and say, hey, I have a nice channel. It will be a great thing for me, and it will give me some motivation to create more videos. Again, thank you, and I hope to see you in my next video.